Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in political philosophy. This lesson is going to just take another brief overview of the subject of political philosophy and really get a better understanding of what we're trying to do when we think about political philosophy, as well as get an understanding of how we read political philosophy, what kinds of things we think about in relation to reading political philosophy, the kind of political philosophy that we read, all these different things, and then just give us a basic background understanding before we start really going into the political ideologies that underpin the vast majority of the world today, at least, or at least historically, things like liberalism and conservatism and socialism and anarchism, etc., etc. And then, like I said, the way in which we're going to structure this series of lessons is going to be spending a good chunk of time looking at the ideologies, looking at different political ideologies, and then talking about ideas. So thinking about things like war and peace, economic justice, distributive justice, and thinking about how these various different people, these various different philosophers would explain and understand these things. So, like I said, this lesson is going to spend some time looking at the fundamental elements of political philosophy, what we are looking for, what kind of motivations we should have in terms of political philosophy, the rationale for political philosophy. It seems to be the case that for those who are thinking of studying philosophy formally at university, political philosophy is quite a broad conversation that is often something that you probably cannot run away from if you want to do a philosophy degree at university, and you say to yourself, well, I only want to do metaphysics, or I only want to do ethics or aesthetics or logic. You probably will find yourself being forced, at least at one point or another, into some kind of political philosophy debate and discussion. So you can't really get away from political philosophy. It is one of the most important applications of philosophical principles, at least in my opinion. That and arguably legal philosophy as well, which I'm sure we'll cover in the future. So the question is here, what is the rationale for political philosophy? How can we justify doing philosophy? Why don't we just do politics? Why don't, instead of thinking about political ideologies, thinking about what liberalism would say, thinking about what liberalism means, why do we just say, okay, well, what policies should we implement for a better society? Well, at the fundamental level, both political philosophy and politics as a whole, the sort of study of politics, is informed by a general sensation that we have, a general sensation that things need fixing, a general sensation that there is something that is wrong with not a particular thing in question, but more so a society. The direction in which a society is going is not correct or needs changing in some kind of way. You might believe, for example, that we treat asylum seekers in a way that is fundamentally wrong. For those of you who are living in the United Kingdom, you might definitely believe that, given the kind of policies that have been implemented recently. You may believe that the way in which the country, whichever country you're living in, the way they handled the coronavirus pandemic was inadequate, or was excessive, or was both in some way. Maybe they did the wrong things. Maybe they didn't implement the right policy. Maybe the lockdowns were unjustified. What kind of balance can we have between the economic deficiencies that would have been caused as a result of locking down a country for over a year versus the benefit of saving lives under the coronavirus pandemic? You might believe, for example, that the vaccine mandate is something that is an immoral. It should be immoral. It should not be. The state should not be allowed to force somebody to get a vaccine, for example. All of these things are questions of politics. These are all beliefs that will essentially boil down to the idea that something is wrong and we should fix how these things are done, or how these rules are made, or what rules are made, and how society ought to be ordered. And so the result of this is, what I've just cited here is a number of examples of sort of mainstream bread and butter politics, actual political policy-based questions. Okay, how does the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland deal with asylum seekers? That is a politics question. That is a political question. It is a question about the Rwanda policy that is going through. It is a question about the relationship of Great Britain to the European Convention on Human Rights. It is a relationship about our relationship, specifically the United Kingdom's relationship to the Refugee Convention. all of which are, of course, not only political, but they're also legal. It's also a relationship to do with the sort of inherent, potentially inherent xenophobia that exists in British society. This is something that is historically very, very interesting. The way in which Britain has treated immigrants and asylum seekers in the past is very, very interesting. One of the main rationales and justifications for the United Kingdom leaving the European Union in Brexit was to protect our borders, if you will. But again, for those of you who know anything about the EU, that's obviously not how it works. But fundamentally, we're talking about questions of politics. But what is arguably the case is that political philosophy is something that exists at a higher level to that of politics. It is something that is more abstract and meta, the extent to which that politics, the actual idea of what policies one ought to implement, exists downstream from your understanding and your rationale and justifications for political philosophy. So you will understand that in a similar way that meta-ethics exists, and what exists downstream from meta-ethics is normative ethics and then applied ethics, you might come to the conclusion that political philosophy is something that you do and you study and you get a good understanding of, and then from this you get an idea of what you believe is right and wrong, what you believe ought to be done about society, how you believe society ought to be ordered, and those ideas are then enshrined and then inbuilt into what you think should be the correct course of action, the correct policy in a particular circumstance. When it comes to reading political philosophy, there are a couple of ways in which you can do it, okay? And there's no one right or wrong answer to doing political philosophy, to reading philosophy in general. Some people will say that in order to truly and properly understand philosophy, you have to read the primary text, the primary sources. I would argue, personally, that you probably don't, given the fact that people who are philosophers have been able to synthesize and explain ideas sometimes better than the original philosophers have done, given the fact that a lot of the old philosophies that exist, people like Aristotle, people like Kant, people like Marx, are very convoluted and very difficult. But you should have at least some exposure to the core key political writings at some point. So these ways apply to philosophy more generally. Personally, for ease and simplicity, and for speed, for those who are studying philosophy, I would always recommend examining and reading philosophy from a perspective of reading textbooks and encyclopedia articles, and reading journal articles where people explain what these philosophical people think. This is what I did when I did my philosophy degree, at least. This is an introductory way, at least, to engage in political philosophy through reading, a textbook. A textbook will distill essentially thousands of years of political thought into a more brief and explanatory text. Not only that, but it will synthesize the debates that are had between political philosophers about different political ideas. Not only will you just only get the works and ideas of one or two philosophers in the primary sources, if you read a textbook, you will see what other people thought about those primary sources as well as everything else. The other way is obviously to directly engage in the philosophical texts. This is more difficult, it requires a greater understanding and broader reading, it requires more time on your hands. If you have more time to do so, then I would highly recommend this as well. This series of lessons specifically shall engage with both. The lessons themselves will be structured on the basis of a couple of different textbooks. The two main textbooks that I've cited from here is the Bird's Introduction to Political Philosophy, the second edition from Cambridge University Press. This textbook essentially is going to be the structure of our lessons, looking at the substance of political philosophy, the different ideas in relation to political philosophy, things like economic justice, distributive justice, the idea of specific applied political philosophy ideas. And then you have the Goodin, Petit, and Pogue's version of political philosophy, which is, of course, the Blackwell's companion to political philosophy. This will be our go-to guide for when we start looking at the ideologies. There's a huge section in this textbook which essentially attracts and has different chapters dedicated to each of the different political ideologies, which is, of course, what we're going to begin with. Both of these, if you read either of these or both of them, you will get a really deep and in-depth understanding of political ideas as well as issues in political philosophy. But you will also need to engage in some of the primary texts as well. The main primary texts for political philosophy are the following. You've got Aristotle, for example. You've got J. Austin, which is a little bit more legal philosophy, the philosophy of law, because it's talking a bit more about jurisprudence and legal positivism. But there's some interlapping and overweaving that can exist there. Jeremy Bentham, again, also something that Bentham's writings sort of intersect ethics, law, legal philosophy, and political philosophy to an extent. Hugo Grotius, again, more of an international lawyer, but again also writes quite extensively in political philosophy and understandings of political philosophy, specifically when we're talking about the jus ad bellum and the use of force and war and the philosophy of war. Hayek writes a lot about economics and political economy. When we're talking about the idea of the state and the justification for the state, you will be obviously having to read Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan in relation to and in accordance with John Locke's Second Treatise of Government. And then, of course, when we start to critique the ways in which political economy exists to this day, and the way in which political society exists to this day, we can obviously find the more radical texts, writers such as Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Vladimir Lenin, for example, John Stuart Mill writing about utilitarianism, John Rawls writing about justice, Jean-Jacques Rousseau writing again about the state and the justification for the state, Peter Singer writing about morality and its application to political ideas in Famine, Affluence and Morality, all of which are primary political readings. I've sort of done this in a sort of chronological order, although there is a lot that is mixing about there. We begin with Aristotle. Peter Singer's still alive today, at least. Rousseau's a little bit high up on this list. He should be a bit further down with Locke and Hobbes if we're talking chronologically. But even if you were to take these primary readings, you to read all of these different works, and you were to read both of those textbooks, you would have a top 1% understanding of political philosophy. And essentially what we're going to try and do is synthesize all of these ideas into these lessons for you to understand going forward in the future.